480 BCE. The narrow pass of Thermopylae, northern Greece. King Xerxes I of Persia stood atop a hastily constructed observation platform, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion to something approaching disbelief. Below him, stretched across 8 miles of coastal plain, sat the largest military force ever assembled in human history. 2.6 million men, according to Herodotus, though modern historians estimate between 200,000 and 300,000 actual combatants, still an overwhelming force that had conquered everything in its path from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea. Yet for 3 days, this unstoppable tide of empire had been held at bay by 300 Spartan warriors and their allies, fewer than 7,000 men total, occupying a strip of land barely wide enough for a dozen men to stand abreast. The mathematics of this confrontation defied logic. The Persian army outnumbered the Greek defenders by at least 30 to 1, possibly 50 to 1. They possessed cavalry, archers, siege equipment, and the finest warriors from across 3 continents. The Greeks had bronze spears, wooden shields, and terrain. What Xerxes and his commanders discovered over those 3 blood-soaked days in August 480 BCE was that sometimes terrain and training matter more than numbers, that narrow passages negate numerical advantage, and that warriors trained from age 7 to do one thing perfectly can hold back an empire when every geographic factor favours the defence. This is the story of how tactical brilliance, geographic advantage, and Spartan discipline combined to create the most legendary last stand in military history. How Persian commanders who had crushed rebellions from Babylon to Egypt learned that Greek hoplites were unlike any enemy they had faced, and how 300 men became immortal by choosing certain death over retreat. The story begins not at Thermopylae but 10 years earlier at Marathon, where 10,000 Athenian hoplites had defeated a Persian invasion force of perhaps 25,000 men. That victory, stunning and unexpected, had taught the Greek city-states a crucial lesson. Persian armies, massive and intimidating, could be beaten by disciplined heavy infantry, fighting in tight formation on favourable ground. But Marathon had also taught Xerxes' father, King Darius I, that Greece would not submit without total conquest. When Darius died in 486 BCE, his son Xerxes inherited an obsession. The Persian Empire, stretching from Libya to India, from the Caucasus to the Arabian Sea, controlled approximately 44% of the world's population. Only the fractious, quarrelsome Greek city-states remained independent in the Western Mediterranean, and their independence was an insult to Persian pride. Xerxes spent 4 years preparing an invasion that would crush Greece so thoroughly that resistance would become unthinkable. He assembled warriors from 46 different peoples. The Immortals, Persia's elite 10,000-man infantry force, so named because their numbers were immediately replenished when anyone fell. Medes and Bactrians, Scythian horse archers, Indian troops, Ethiopian warriors, Egyptian marines, and countless others, each contingent bringing their own weapons, tactics, and combat traditions. The Persian engineering corps built bridges across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe, using 674 ships lashed together to create 2 pontoon bridges, wide enough for the army to cross. When storms destroyed the first bridges, Xerxes famously ordered the sea whipped and had the engineers executed, then built the bridges again with heavier cables. His engineers also dug a canal through the Mount Athos Peninsula to allow his fleet of over 600 warships to avoid the dangerous waters where a previous Persian fleet had been destroyed. This was not merely an invasion. It was a demonstration of Persian power so overwhelming that resistance would seem futile. Greek spies observing the preparations reported numbers so large that Greek leaders initially refused to believe them. When the Persian army marched, it took 7 days and 7 nights of continuous movement for the entire force to cross the Hellespont bridges. The supply train alone stretched for miles, carrying food for hundreds of thousands of men, fodder for tens of thousands of horses, and siege equipment for attacking fortified cities. Herodotus claimed the army drank entire rivers dry as it passed. While certainly an exaggeration, the logistical challenge of feeding and moving such a force was unprecedented in ancient warfare. The Greek response was fractured and uncertain. The Greek city-states, notorious for their inability to cooperate, held a series of emergency councils to determine their response. Athens, with the largest navy in Greece, argued for a combined land and sea defence. Sparta, with the most feared army in the Greek world, initially hesitated, citing religious festivals that prevented immediate mobilization. Many Greek cities, calculating the odds, Medized, accepting Persian authority rather than face destruction. The city of Thebes, the Thessalians, and many others chose survival over resistance, but a core group of city-states, led by Sparta and Athens, chose to fight. Their strategy was brutally simple: use geography to neutralize Persian numbers. Greece's mountainous terrain offered numerous defensive positions where narrow passes could be held by small forces against vastly larger armies. The key was identifying the right position and buying enough time for the Greek fleet to engage the Persian navy, because if the Persian fleet could land troops behind any defensive position, the defenders would be surrounded and destroyed. The War Council identified Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, as the ideal defensive position. The pass, located where the mountains of central Greece came closest to the sea, was in places only 15 metres wide, barely wide enough for a cart to pass. The cliffs to the south rose steeply, impassable to large forces. The sea to the north was shallow and treacherous, unsuitable for landing troops. Any army wanting to march south into Greece would have to pass through this narrow corridor, and in that corridor, numbers meant nothing. King Leonidas I of Sparta volunteered to lead the defensive force. The decision was complicated by Spartan religious traditions. The Karnaia, a sacred festival, was underway, and Spartan law forbade sending the army to war during this time. Additionally, the Olympic Games were approaching, another period when warfare was traditionally suspended. These religious constraints were not mere superstition. They were fundamental to Spartan society, laws that could not be broken without divine punishment. Leonidas found a solution. He would lead a personal bodyguard, 300 men selected from the Spartiate class, the elite warrior citizens of Sparta. Technically, this was not the Spartan army but a king's bodyguard, exempt from religious restrictions. But Leonidas chose his 300 with calculated precision. According to Herodotus, he selected only men who already had sons, ensuring that their bloodlines would continue after their deaths. This detail is chilling in its implication. Leonidas was not planning a defensive action with potential retreat. He was organizing a sacrifice. The 300 Spartans were joined by approximately 700 Thespians, 400 Thebans, who may have been hostages to ensure their city's loyalty, and contingents from several other Greek cities, bringing the total defensive force to between 5,000 and 7,000 men. This was never meant to be the entire Greek defensive force. The plan called for reinforcements after the religious festivals ended, but those reinforcements would arrive too late. When the Greeks reached Thermopylae in mid-August 480 BCE, they found the pass partially defended by a crumbling wall built during an earlier conflict. The Phocians, a local Greek people, had built this wall to defend against Thessalian invasions. Leonidas ordered his men to rebuild and strengthen it, creating a defensive position at the narrowest point of the pass, the middle gate, where the passage was barely 15 metres wide. The defensive position was nearly perfect. The wall blocked the pass with a single small gate. Cliffs rose behind the defenders, preventing flanking from the south. The sea protected their north flank. Any attack would have to come directly through the gate, where the Greeks could form a phalanx and fight in the only combat style where they were unmatched. The phalanx, the Greek heavy infantry formation, was the most effective fighting system in the Mediterranean world. Each hoplite, heavily armoured infantryman, carried a large round shield called a hoplon, or aspis, nearly 3 feet in diameter and weighing about 15 pounds, made of wood and bronze. The shield was held by inserting the left arm through a central band and gripping a handle near the rim. This method of holding meant that each hoplite's shield protected not just himself but the man to his left, creating an interlocking wall of bronze when men stood shoulder to shoulder. The primary weapon was the dory, a spear 7 to 9 feet long with an iron spearhead and a bronze butt spike. Hoplites also carried a short sword called a xiphos as a backup weapon. They wore bronze helmets, breastplates and greaves protecting their shins. A fully equipped hoplite carried approximately 60 to 70 pounds of equipment, and in this equipment they trained constantly. Spartan training was unlike anything else in the ancient world. Boys were taken from their families at age 7 and entered the agouge, the brutal Spartan education system that lasted until age 20. They learned to fight in formation, to endure pain without complaint, to survive on minimal rations, and to place the group's survival above their own. By the time a Spartan earned full citizenship at age 30, he had been training for combat for 23 years. The Spartans at Thermopylae were not young men. Leonidas himself was approximately 60 years old. His 300 were mature warriors, men in their 30s, 40s and 50s, veterans of numerous campaigns, selected not for youth or strength, but for skill, discipline, and the fact that they had sons to continue their bloodlines. When the Persian army arrived at Thermopylae in late August, Xerxes reportedly rode forward to observe the Greek position personally. What he saw baffled him. A small force of men behind a rebuilt wall, and beyond the wall, Spartans exercising and combing their long hair, seemingly unconcerned about the vast army approaching them. Xerxes sent a scout to observe more closely. The scout reported that the Spartans were preparing for battle according to their customs, performing ritual exercises and grooming themselves as if for a ceremony. Xerxes, not understanding Spartan culture, found this behavior absurd. He summoned Demaratus, an exiled Spartan king now serving as his advisor, and asked what this meant. Demaratus' response, recorded by Herodotus, is one of history's great moments of foreshadowing. These men have come to fight us for control of the pass, and they are preparing for that fight. It is their custom, when they are about to put their lives in danger, to arrange their hair. The Spartans were preparing to die beautifully, adhering to their cultural practice of grooming before battle, treating war as a sacred ritual rather than mere violence. Xerxes, still confident in his overwhelming numbers, waited 4 days, expecting the Greeks to flee when they fully comprehended the size of the Persian force. When the Greeks remained in position, Xerxes sent emissaries with an ultimatum: surrender your weapons. Leonidas's response became legendary throughout the ancient world: Mol and Lab, come and take them. On the 5th day, Xerxes ordered the attack. He began with his Median and Sicyan troops, reliable warriors who had fought in numerous Persian campaigns. The Persians were lightly armoured, compared to Greek hoplites. They wore felt or leather armour, carried wicker shields and fought primarily with bows and short spears. Their tactics emphasized mobility, missile fire, and overwhelming numbers. These tactics had conquered most of the known world. At Thermopylae, they were useless. The Persian troops advanced in waves toward the Greek position. The pass was so narrow that only a fraction of the Persian force could engage at any time, perhaps a few dozen men abreast. When they reached the rebuilt wall, they encountered the Greek phalanx in perfect formation. The front rank of Greeks, shields locked, spears projecting forward at waist height, formed an impenetrable wall of bronze and iron. The Persians had never faced anything like the Greek phalanx. Their wicker shields could not stop the heavy Greek spears. Their short spears could not reach past the Greek shields. Their arrows were largely ineffective against Greek bronze armour at close range. When Persian warriors pressed forward, the Greek spears gutted them. When they tried to break the shield wall, the mass and discipline of the phalanx held firm. The narrow pass meant that all of Persia's numerical advantage was negated. Only the men at the very front of the Persian formation could fight, and they were fighting at a severe disadvantage against the best heavy infantry in the world. Herodotus describes the Medes and Scythians being slaughtered in waves, replaced by fresh troops who met the same fate. The bodies began to pile up in the narrow pass, creating obstacles that further impeded the Persian advance. After hours of futile attacks, with thousands of his troops dead or wounded, Xerxes recalled the Medes and sent in his elite force, the Immortals. The Immortals were Persia's finest infantry, 10,000 strong, equipped with better armour and weapons than regular Persian troops. Their commander, Hydarnes, was one of Xerxes' most trusted generals. These were veteran soldiers who had put down rebellions and conquered kingdoms. Xerxes and his commanders believed the Immortals' superior training and equipment would break the Greek line where the Medes had failed. The Immortals advanced with discipline and confidence. They had never been defeated. Their reputation alone had caused enemies to surrender without fighting. They reached the Greek position, expecting to sweep aside the defenders through superior skill and numbers. Instead, they discovered that discipline and training alone do not overcome fundamental tactical disadvantages. The Immortals were still more lightly armoured than Greek hoplites. Their shields were still inferior, their spears were still shorter, and they were still attacking through a narrow pass where only a tiny fraction of their number could engage at any time. the Spartans demonstrated a tactical innovation that devastated the Persian attacks. They would pretend to retreat in apparent panic, drawing the Persians forward into the narrow space. The Persians, seeing their enemy fleeing, would break formation to pursue. Then the Spartans would suddenly wheel around, reform their phalanx, and attack the now disordered Persians with devastating effect. This feigned retreat tactic required extraordinary discipline. In the chaos of battle, with men screaming, blood spraying, and weapons clashing, the Spartans could execute complex maneuvers in perfect coordination. They could retreat in apparent disorder while maintaining formation integrity, then turn and attack as a unified force. This level of training was beyond anything the Persians had encountered. Herodotus records that the Immortals suffered terrible casualties without making any progress against the Greek position. Xerxes, watching from his observation point, reportedly leaped from his throne 3 times in fear for his army, watching his elite troops being slaughtered by a force that numbered less than 1/100th of his total army. The first day of battle ended with the pass still firmly in Greek hands, and the ground before the wall covered in Persian dead. Xerxes had learned a horrifying lesson. In a narrow pass against heavily armoured Greek infantry, fighting in disciplined formation, numbers meant nothing. The second day of battle began with Xerxes hoping that the Greeks had exhausted themselves in the previous day's fighting. Surely no force that small could maintain such ferocious resistance against continuous attacks. He ordered fresh troops to assault the position, rotating units to keep constant pressure on the defenders. The Greeks, however, had also rotated their forces. The 300 Spartans did not hold the line alone. Contingents from different Greek cities took turns at the wall, each fighting for a period before being relieved by fresh troops. This rotation meant the men actually fighting were always relatively fresh, while the Persian attackers, even when replaced, faced the same tactical impossibility. The second day saw the same pattern as the first: Persian troops advancing in waves, meeting the immovable wall of the Greek phalanx, dying in horrific numbers, and achieving nothing. The Spartans continued their feigned retreats, luring overconfident Persians into traps. The other Greek contingents fought with determination, knowing that retreat meant certain death as the Persians would simply march south and destroy their cities. As the second day wore on, Persian morale began to crack. Soldiers could see the bodies piled before the Greek position. They knew that advancing meant probable death against an enemy that seemed impossible to defeat. Some units reportedly refused to advance until threatened with execution by their own officers. The Persian command structure, accustomed to intimidating enemies into submission through displays of overwhelming force, had no answer for an enemy that could not be intimidated and could not be outflanked. That evening, as Xerxes contemplated the unthinkable possibility of retreat, a solution arrived in the form of a Greek traitor. Ephialtes, a local man from the region around Thermopylae, came to the Persian camp seeking an audience with the king. His offer was simple. For a substantial reward, he would reveal a mountain path that bypassed the Greek position entirely, allowing Persian troops to march around the pass and attack the Greeks from behind. This path, called the Thermopylae Trail, was known to the locals but supposedly guarded by 1,000 Phocian troops positioned to prevent exactly this kind of flanking maneuver. Ephialtes assured Xerxes that the Phocians could be surprised and defeated, allowing the Immortals to descend behind the Greek position and trap the defenders between two forces. Xerxes immediately ordered Hydans to take the Immortals and follow Ephialtes along the mountain path that night. The Immortals began their night march, climbing through the mountains in darkness, following narrow trails that twisted through the forested slopes above Thermopylae. The Thermopylae Trail was not an easy march. It was steep, rocky, and treacherous in darkness. But the Immortals were disciplined troops capable of difficult maneuvers, and the promise of finally overcoming the stubborn Greeks drove them forward. Near dawn, the Immortals encountered the Phocian guards positioned along the trail. The meeting was almost accidental. The Phocians, expecting any threat to come from the Persian army below in the pass, were not maintaining vigilant watch on the trail itself. When they heard the sound of thousands of feet rustling through the fallen oak leaves that covered the ground, they scrambled to form a defensive line. The Immortals, seeing the Phocian forces assembling, showered them with arrows. The Phocians, believing they were the primary target of the Persian attack, retreated to higher ground to make a defensive stand. This was exactly what the Immortals wanted. Hydans had no interest in fighting the Phocians. His mission was to reach the Greek rear, not to engage in a mountain battle. While the Phocians prepared for an assault that never came, the Immortals simply marched past them along the trail, continuing their descent toward the southern exit of the pass. As dawn broke on the third day, Greek sentries brought devastating news to Leonidas. Persian troops had been spotted descending the mountain path. The position was compromised. Within hours, perhaps by mid-morning, the Greeks would be trapped between the main Persian army in front and the Immortals behind. Leonidas called a council of war. The situation was clear. Remaining in position meant certain death for the entire force. Retreating immediately might allow most of the men to escape. The Greek allies were dismissed. Leonidas ordered the contingents from various Greek cities to withdraw immediately, to live and fight another day. Most obeyed, marching south as quickly as possible before the Immortals could complete their flanking movement, but 3 groups remained. The 300 Spartans stayed because Spartan law forbade retreat. To abandon a position in battle was the ultimate dishonor, punishable by loss of citizenship and social death. The Spartans would hold until they were relieved or until they died. There was no third option. The 700 Thespians, free to leave, chose to stay. Their commander declared that Thespiae would not abandon Sparta in its moment of trial. These men, from a small city with no military tradition comparable to Sparta's, chose certain death to honor their alliance. The 400 Thebans remained, though sources disagree whether they stayed voluntarily or were kept as hostages. Some ancient sources claim they later surrendered to the Persians, though this may be Athenian propaganda against a city that later medazed. As the remaining Greeks prepared for the final battle, Leonidas reportedly told his men to eat a hearty breakfast, because they would dine in Hades that night. The Spartans, true to their culture, groomed themselves carefully, combing their long hair and checking their equipment with the same meticulous attention they would give to any other battle. They were preparing to die beautifully. The final battle began with the Greeks abandoning the defensive wall and moving forward into the wider part of the pass. This was a tactical decision. If they remained behind the wall, they would be trapped when the Immortals arrived from behind. By moving forward into slightly wider ground, they could fight with more freedom of movement and potentially inflict heavier casualties before being overwhelmed. The Persians, seeing the Greeks advancing from their defensive position, believed they were witnessing a desperate final attack. Xerxes ordered a general assault, committing vast numbers of troops in a massive push designed to crush the Greek force through sheer weight of numbers. What followed was slaughter on a scale that shocked even the battle-hardened Persian veterans. The Greeks fought with the fury of men who knew they were dead, who had accepted death and now sought only to make their deaths as costly as possible for their enemies. They fought not in the disciplined, controlled manner of the previous 2 days, but with berserker rage. Spears shattered, and they drew their swords. Swords broke, and they used their shields as weapons. When shields were torn away, they fought with fists, teeth, and anything they could grab. The Spartans demonstrated why they were feared throughout Greece. Their training, their discipline, their absolute refusal to break, even in the face of certain death, created a killing zone where Persians died in horrifying numbers. The Persian troops, despite their vast numerical advantage, found themselves fighting men who could not be intimidated, could not be frightened, and would not stop until they were physically destroyed. During this final engagement, King Leonidas was killed. The sources disagree on exactly how he died, but what happened next is clear. The Spartans fought ferociously to recover his body, understanding that allowing the Persian king to desecrate a Spartan king's corpse would be an unbearable dishonor. 4 times the Spartans recovered Leonidas's body. 4 times the Persians drove them back and recaptured it. Finally, the Spartans formed a defensive circle around their fallen king and fought off every assault until the Immortals arrived from the rear. When the Immortals descended from the mountain path and attacked from behind, the remaining Greeks were finally surrounded. They fought their way to a small hill within the pass, a position that offered slightly better defensive ground. Here, the last of the Greeks made their stand. The survivors, now fewer than 1,000 men, formed a circle on the hilltop. Most had lost their spears, many had broken swords. They were wounded, exhausted, and completely surrounded by tens of thousands of Persian troops. The Persians, having learned the cost of fighting these men up close, no longer attempted direct assault. They surrounded the hill and killed the remaining Greeks with arrows and javelins, standing at a distance and firing volley after volley into the defensive circle until every Greek was dead. When the battle finally ended, the pass belonged to Xerxes, but the cost had been staggering. Ancient sources claim 20,000 Persians died at Thermopylae, though modern historians consider this inflated. More realistic estimates place Persian casualties at 2,000 to 5,000 dead and many more wounded. Against a defensive force of fewer than 500 men in the final battle, these casualties represented a kill ratio unprecedented in ancient warfare. Xerxes, viewing the battlefield after the fight, ordered his men to find Leonidas's body among the dead. When the Spartan king's corpse was identified, Xerxes committed an act that shocked the Greek world. He ordered Leonidas's head cut off and his body crucified, a deliberate desecration that violated the customs of honourable warfare. This act of rage revealed how deeply the defence of Thermopylae had affected the Persian king. This small force of Greeks had humiliated his vast army, killed thousands of his soldiers, and delayed his invasion by 3 days. The beheading and crucifixion of Leonidas was Xerxes' revenge against a dead man who had made him look weak. But Thermopylae was not a Greek victory. The Persians marched south, destroyed Athens, and occupied much of Greece. The strategic goal of the defensive action, buying time for the Greek fleet to engage the Persian navy, and for the Greek city-states to organize a more substantial defense, was achieved, but at the cost of complete destruction of the defending force. The true victory of Thermopylae was not military but psychological and symbolic. The story of the 300 Spartans spread throughout Greece with incredible speed. These men had shown that Persians could be defeated, that discipline and courage could overcome vast numerical superiority, and that Greeks, willing to fight to the death, could hold their ground against the seemingly unstoppable Persian Empire. The sacrifice at Thermopylae stiffened Greek resolve at a crucial moment. When the Persian fleet was shattered at the Battle of Salamis later that year, Greek crews fought with the knowledge that the Spartans had shown how to stand against impossible odds. When the Persian army was finally destroyed at Plataea the following year, Greek hoplites advanced knowing that 300 of their countrymen had held back the entire Persian army for 3 days. The poet Simonides composed an epitaph for the Spartans at Thermopylae that was inscribed on a stone at the battlefield. "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here obedient to their laws we lie." This simple statement captured the essence of the Spartan sacrifice. These men had not fought for personal glory or survival. They had fought because Spartan law demanded it, because their culture valued honour above life, and because they believed that some things were worth dying for. The Battle of Thermopylae entered Greek cultural memory as the ultimate example of courage against overwhelming odds. It was taught to Greek children for generations, celebrated in poetry and art, and held up as the ideal of how warriors should conduct themselves. The Spartans became legendary not for winning, but for how they chose to die. For the Persians, Thermopylae was a Pyrrhic victory that foreshadowed their ultimate defeat. They had learned that conquering Greece would not be the easy campaign they expected. The Greeks would fight with a ferocity and discipline that Persian numbers could not easily overcome. The 3-day delay at Thermopylae gave the Greek fleet time to position itself at Salamis. The heavy Persian casualties, including significant losses among the elite Immortals, weakened the Persian army before the decisive battles to come. Most significantly, Thermopylae demonstrated the fundamental limitation of the Persian military system. The Persian Empire's strength lay in its ability to assemble vast armies from numerous subject peoples, but these diverse forces, while numerous, lack the cohesion and training of Greek hoplites. At Thermopylae, when terrain negated numerical advantage, the superior training and equipment of Greek heavy infantry proved decisive. Modern analysis of the battle reveals how perfectly the Greeks exploited every geographic and tactical advantage available to them. The narrow pass eliminated Persian cavalry, rendered their numerical superiority irrelevant, and forced them to fight the Greeks' preferred style of combat. The rebuilt wall created a choke point that could be held by a tiny force. The rotation of Greek units ensured that the men actually fighting were always relatively fresh. The feigned retreats exploited Persian unfamiliarity with Greek tactics and discipline. The decision to hold the position even when flanked maximised Greek casualties inflicted while buying. Crucial time for the retreating allies. Yet for all the tactical brilliance, the true lesson of Thermopylae is about the power of accepting death. The Spartans did not fight hoping to survive. They fought knowing they would die, and this certainty liberated them from fear. They could execute complex maneuvers under fire because they had already accepted the worst possible outcome. They could stand against overwhelming numbers because death held no terror for men who had prepared for it since childhood. This psychological dimension of Spartan warfare is what made them so formidable. Other warriors fought bravely hoping to survive. Spartans fought bravely expecting to die. This fundamental difference in mindset created warriors who could not be broken by fear or intimidation, who would hold positions that any rational calculation said were indefensible, and who valued honor and duty above the most basic human instinct for survival. The Persian commanders at Thermopylae learned this lesson at terrible cost. They had expected the Greeks to flee when confronted with overwhelming force. They assumed that any rational defender would surrender when defeat was certain. They believed that their vast numbers would intimidate the Greeks into submission. Instead, they discovered an enemy for whom surrender was literally worse than death, for whom honor mattered more than survival, and who would fight with undiminished ferocity even when hope was gone. After the Persian wars ended with Greek victory, the story of Thermopylae became central to Greek identity. The Spartans were honored throughout Greece as the men who had bought time with their lives, who had shown that Persians were not invincible, and who had embodied the Greek ideal of arete, excellence and virtue in the face of death. Decades later, when the Greek historian Herodotus wrote his account of the Persian wars, he devoted substantial attention to the Battle of Thermopylae despite its limited strategic importance. Herodotus understood that this battle mattered not for its military outcome but for what it revealed about courage, duty, and the human capacity for self-sacrifice. The story continued to resonate through Western history. Roman writers held up the Spartans at Thermopylae as examples of virtue and courage. Medieval chronicles retold the story as a Christian parable about sacrifice. Modern historians and military theorists have analysed the battle as a case study in how to defend against superior numbers. The phrase "molon labe," come and take them, has been adopted by military units and political movements as a statement of defiant resistance. The image of 300 warriors holding back an empire has become a universal symbol of courage against impossible odds. Yet the real Battle of Thermopylae was more complex and more human than the legend. The defenders were not just 300 Spartans but 7,000 Greeks from multiple cities, most of whom survived by retreating when further resistance became futile. The Spartans stayed not from superhuman courage, but from cultural and legal constraints that made retreat impossible. Their sacrifice, while inspiring, was also the product of a brutal military culture that valued honor above life and trained its citizens from childhood to prefer death to dishonor. The Persians were not evil invaders, but the representatives of a vast multicultural empire pursuing what they saw as legitimate conquest. Their defeat at Thermopylae and in the broader Persian wars was not inevitable, but the result of specific tactical and strategic mistakes, most notably their failure to account for how Greek terrain and Greek fighting styles would negate Persian advantages. The real Thermopylae was a brutal, terrifying and exhausting 3 days of violence that ended with a large pile of corpses on both sides and a Persian victory that felt like defeat. But the legend of Thermopylae, the story of 300 warriors holding back an empire, refusing to retreat, fighting to the last man in defense of their homeland, this legend has proven more powerful and more enduring than the tactical realities of the battle. In the end, perhaps what matters most about Thermopylae is not the strategic outcome but the question it poses to every generation. What would you die for? What cause or principle or loyalty is worth sacrificing everything? The Spartans answered that question with their lives, and their answer, whether we agree with their values or not, continues to challenge and inspire 2,500 years later. Persian commanders arrived at Thermopylae expecting an easy victory. They left having learned that some men cannot be defeated, only killed. They discovered that terrain and training can overcome numbers. They found that warriors who have accepted death fight differently than warriors who hope to survive. The 300 Spartans and their Greek allies did not save Greece at Thermopylae. That salvation would come later at Salamis and Plataea. But they proved that Greece could be saved, that Persian might was not unstoppable, and that free men fighting for their homes could stand against an empire. In doing so, they carved their names into history so deeply that 2,500 years later we still speak of them with awe. The thunder of Persian numbers broke against the bronze wall of Spartan discipline, and for 3 days 300 men held back the tide of empire. When the pass finally fell, it fell only because geography, not courage, had been overcome. The Spartans lay dead, but they had won something more valuable than victory. They had won immortality. The aftermath of Thermopylae rippled through both empires with consequences that neither side fully anticipated. In the Persian camp, the immediate reaction was relief mixed with deep unease. Xerxes had won, his army now had access to southern Greece, but the cost in blood and time had shaken his confidence. The Persian king had expected the Greeks to collapse when faced with his overwhelming force. Instead, he had discovered an enemy that fought harder when outnumbered, that preferred death to surrender, and that could inflict casualties all out of proportion to their numbers. The Persian army that marched south from Thermopylae was not the same force that had arrived. The soldiers had seen their comrades die by the thousands against a tiny defensive force. They had watched the elite Immortals, supposedly invincible, get slaughtered in the narrow pass. They had learned that Greek hoplites in formation were nearly impossible to defeat in close combat. This knowledge bred caution and fear. When Persian troops later encountered Greek forces, they approached with hesitation rather than confidence, remembering the wall of bronze and the forest of spears that had turned the hot gates into a killing ground. The execution and desecration of Leonidas's body, while satisfying Xerxes' rage, was a propaganda disaster for Persia. In the ancient world, proper treatment of enemy dead was expected even between bitter enemies. The mutilation of a king's corpse was seen as barbaric and dishonourable. When news of Leonidas's beheading and crucifixion reached the Greek city-states, it transformed the Spartan king into a martyr and stiffened Greek resolve. Athenians who might have considered negotiating with Persia were outraged. Spartans who had been reluctant to fully commit to the war became implacable enemies. The desecration turned a military defeat into a moral victory for Greece. Within Sparta itself, the news of the 300's destruction was received with pride rather than grief. The Spartans had done exactly what was expected of them. They had obeyed their laws, held their position, and died fighting. In Spartan culture, this was the highest achievement possible. The families of the 300 were honoured rather than pitied. The mothers and wives did not mourn in public but celebrated their men's glorious deaths. There is a famous story, possibly apocryphal, of a Spartan mother whose son survived Thermopylae by being away on a mission. When he returned home, she asked why he had not died with his comrades. When he could not provide a satisfactory answer, she allegedly killed him herself to remove the stain of dishonour from her family. While this story may not be literally true, it reflects the extreme nature of Spartan values, where honour mattered more than life itself. The other Greek city-states responded to Thermopylae with a mixture of awe and determination. The Thespians, who had lost 700 of their citizens at the battle, were particularly honoured. For a small city to sacrifice such a large portion of its fighting men was extraordinary. The Thespians became symbols of Greek unity and courage, proving that not only Spartans could fight to the death when honour demanded it. Athens, which had evacuated its population to the island of Salamis and other safe locations, used Thermopylae as a rallying cry. The Athenian leader, Themistocles, understood that the psychological impact of the battle could be leveraged to keep the Greek alliance together. He argued that if 300 Spartans could hold back the Persian army for 3 days, imagine what the combined Greek forces could accomplish with proper strategy and unified command. The strategic situation after Thermopylae was actually more favourable to the Greeks than it appeared. Yes, the Persians had broken through the pass and were marching toward Athens, but they had been delayed long enough for the Greek fleet to position itself at Salamis. The narrow waters of the Salamis Strait would do for the Greek navy what the pass at Thermopylae had done for the Greek army, negate Persian numerical superiority by forcing battle in confined space where Greek tactics and training could dominate. Xerxes, confident after finally breaking through at Thermopylae, made a crucial strategic error. He divided his forces, sending his fleet to attack the Greeks at Salamis, while his army marched south to occupy Athens. This division of forces meant that neither the Persian army nor navy could support the other during the critical battles to come. The lesson of Thermopylae, that concentrated force matters more than total numbers, was one Xerxes failed to learn. The Battle of Salamis in September 480 BCE vindicated the sacrifice at Thermopylae. The Greek fleet, fighting in narrow waters where Persian numbers were irrelevant, destroyed over 200 Persian ships while losing only 40 of their own. Xerxes, watching from a throne erected on the shore, witnessed the destruction of his fleet in a naval replay of what had happened at Thermopylae. Geography and Greek tactics combined to turn overwhelming numbers into a liability. After Salamis, Xerxes made a decision that revealed how deeply Thermopylae and its aftermath had affected him. Rather than continue the campaign with his massive army, he withdrew to Asia, leaving behind a force of approximately 100,000 men under the command of Mardonius, his best general. Ancient sources claim Xerxes feared the Greeks might destroy his bridges across the Hellespont, trapping him in Europe. But modern historians believe the real reason was psychological. Xerxes had lost confidence in his ability to conquer Greece. The 3 days at Thermopylae had shown him that Greek resistance would be ferocious and costly, and Salamis had demonstrated that Greek skill could overcome Persian numbers even at sea. The king who had arrived in Greece expecting easy conquest departed having achieved little beyond the temporary occupation of Athens and the loss of thousands of soldiers and hundreds of ships. Mardonius, left to finish the conquest of Greece, understood the lessons of Thermopylae better than his king. He avoided direct confrontations with Greek hoplites in confined spaces. He used his cavalry to harass and wear down Greek forces. He attempted to divide the Greek alliance through diplomacy and bribery. For months, his strategy worked, keeping the Greeks off balance and preventing them from assembling a unified army. But in August 479 BCE, 1 year after Thermopylae, the Greeks finally assembled a massive army of approximately 100,000 hoplites and light troops near the city of Plataea. The Spartans, remembering their 300 comrades, sent their largest army in decades, 10,000 Spartiates plus 35,000 Helots. Their slave class pressed into military service. The Athenians sent 8,000 hoplites. Dozens of other Greek cities contributed contingents. This was the army that should have been at Thermopylae, finally assembled and ready to fight. The Battle of Plataea was everything Thermopylae was not. Instead of a defensive action in a narrow pass, this was a massive set-piece battle on open ground. Instead of a small force buying time, this was the full strength of Greece seeking decisive victory. Instead of certain death, the Greeks fought with confidence born from the knowledge that they could defeat Persians when tactics and terrain were in their favour. The battle raged for days, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Mardonius used his cavalry brilliantly, cutting Greek supply lines and forcing them to relocate. The Greeks used their hoplite formations to repel multiple Persian attacks. Finally, Mardonius made a fatal error. Observing what he thought was a Greek retreat, he ordered his elite Persian infantry, the remnants of the Immortals who had survived Thermopylae, to pursue and destroy the withdrawing Greeks. The Greeks were not retreating, but repositioning. When the Persian infantry advanced, they were met by the full force of the Spartan phalanx on ground of the Greeks' choosing. What followed was a massacre. The Spartans, fighting with the memory of their 300 comrades, tore through the Persian lines with unstoppable fury. Mardonius himself was killed in the fighting, struck down by a Spartan named Amnestus. With their commander dead and the Greeks pressing forward on all sides, the Persian army collapsed. The survivors fled north, pursued by Greek cavalry and light troops. Of the 100,000 Persians who had begun the battle, only a fraction escaped Greece alive. The Persian attempt to conquer Greece was over. Plataea was the decisive military victory, but Thermopylae was the moral foundation upon which that victory was built. The Spartans who fought at Plataea remembered the 300. They remembered that their comrades had held against impossible odds. They remembered that Spartans do not retreat. When the Immortals advanced at Plataea, the Spartans saw the same enemy who had finally overcome their brothers at Thermopylae, and they made those Immortals pay in blood for every Spartan who had fallen in the pass. The combined impact of Thermopylae, Salamis and Plataea ended Persian expansion into Europe permanently. Never again would a Persian king attempt to conquer mainland Greece. The Greeks had proven that their city-state system, for all its internal conflicts and weaknesses, could unite when facing existential threat. They had demonstrated that free citizens fighting for their homes were more than a match for the conscripted armies of empires. They had shown the world that geography, tactics, and training could overcome vast numerical superiority. But the victory came at tremendous cost. Thousands of Greeks had died in the battles. Athens had been burned and would need to be rebuilt. The Greek economy was disrupted. Many smaller cities had been destroyed or depopulated. The trauma of the Persian invasion would shape Greek politics and culture for generations. The success of Greek resistance also planted the seeds of future conflicts. Sparta and Athens, united against Persia, would spend the next several decades competing for dominance in Greece. The Peloponnesian War, which would nearly destroy Greek civilization, grew partially from tensions that emerged during and after the Persian Wars. Sparta's military reputation, enhanced by Thermopylae, made other Greek cities fearful of Spartan power. Athens' naval dominance, demonstrated at Salamis, created an Athenian empire that rivaled Sparta's land power. The unity that had defeated Persia could not be maintained in peace. For Persia, the failed invasion of Greece was humiliating but not catastrophic. The empire remained vast and powerful, controlling territory from Egypt to India. Greek independence was annoying but not threatening to core Persian interests. However, the psychological impact was significant. The Persian military, previously considered invincible, had been proven beatable. Subject peoples who had contemplated rebellion now had evidence that Persian armies could be defeated. The aura of invincibility that had helped maintain Persian control over their diverse empire was shattered. The memory of Thermopylae was carefully cultivated in Sparta. The site of the battle became a sacred location, with monuments erected to honour the fallen. Every year, Spartan officials would visit the site to perform religious ceremonies. The names of the 300 were inscribed on stone, ensuring they would never be forgotten. Simonides' epitaph was carved at the battlefield, visible to all travellers passing through the hot gates. The battle became central to Spartan identity and military culture. The Spartans used Thermopylae as the ultimate example of what they expected from their warriors. Young men going through the agog were taught detailed accounts of the battle. They were told that dying in defence of Sparta was the highest honour achievable. They learned that retreat was never acceptable, that surrender was unthinkable, and that a Spartan's duty was to return with his shield or on it, victorious or dead but never defeated. This extreme military culture, reinforced by the legend of Thermopylae, made Sparta the dominant land power in Greece for over a century. No Greek city wanted to fight Sparta if it could be avoided, because Spartan warriors simply would not break. They would hold any position, no matter how hopeless, until relieved or killed. In battles throughout the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, Spartan forces repeatedly demonstrated the same qualities their ancestors had shown at Thermopylae, fighting to the last man when necessary and never accepting defeat. But the Spartan obsession with military excellence and honour came at a terrible price. Spartan society was rigid, brutal, and ultimately unsustainable. The training that created perfect warriors also created men incapable of adapting to changing circumstances. The culture that produced the 300 also produced a society where citizens were a tiny minority, ruling over a vast population of helots, slaves who were constantly on the verge of rebellion. The Spartans spent so much effort on military training that they neglected trade, arts, philosophy, and the other aspects of civilization that made Athens and other Greek cities culturally vibrant. By the 4th century BCE, Sparta's population of full citizens was declining. Battle casualties, the requirement that only men who had completed the agog and could pay their mess fees could be citizens, and social pressures that discouraged large families combined to shrink the Spartiate class year by year. By 371 BCE, when Sparta was finally defeated by Thebes at the Battle of Leuctra, they could field only about 1,000 Spartiates, compared to the 8,000 or more they had possessed a century earlier. The same culture that created the legend of Thermopylae was slowly destroying Sparta from within. Thermopylae's influence extended far beyond Greece. Roman military culture was heavily influenced by Greek models, and Roman writers frequently cited Thermopylae as an example of proper military virtue. Roman soldiers were taught that the greatest honour was to die fighting for Rome, never to surrender, and to prefer death to dishonour, principles taken directly from the Spartan example. When Roman legions faced impossible odds, commanders would invoke Thermopylae to inspire their troops. The story of the 300 became part of the cultural DNA of Western military tradition. Medieval knights were taught the story of Thermopylae as an example of proper chivalric behaviour. Crusaders marching to the Holy Land saw themselves as following in the footsteps of the 300, fighting against overwhelming odds for a sacred cause. Renaissance humanists studying classical texts rediscovered the detailed accounts of the battle, and used them as examples of civic virtue and self-sacrifice. The story continued evolving through the centuries, with each era interpreting Thermopylae through its own cultural lens. During the American Revolution, colonists compared themselves to the Greeks, fighting for freedom against the Persian Empire of British tyranny. During World War II, Allied soldiers defending hopeless positions against Nazi advances were compared to the 300 Spartans. The battle has been referenced in countless books, films, poems, and works of art, each adding new layers to the legend while sometimes obscuring the historical reality. Modern scholarship has worked to separate the legend from the history, to understand what actually happened at Thermopylae versus what the Greeks wanted to believe happened. Archaeological work at the site has revealed that the geography has changed significantly over 2,500 years. The shoreline has moved, the pass has widened, and the hill where the last stand occurred has been partially eroded. Reconstructing the exact battlefield requires careful analysis of ancient descriptions combined with modern geological understanding. Historical analysis has revealed that the Greek force was larger and more diverse than the legend suggests, that Persian casualties were likely lower than ancient sources claimed, and that the tactical situation was more complex than a simple story of brave defenders against cowardly invaders. Modern military historians have studied Thermopylae as a case study in defensive warfare. The battle demonstrates several timeless principles. First, terrain can be the most important factor in battle, sometimes more significant than numbers, weapons, or training. Second, a well-prepared defense can hold against vastly superior numbers if the geography allows it. Third, morale and discipline matter enormously in combat. The Spartans' willingness to fight to the death gave them an advantage that numbers could not overcome. Fourth, tactical flexibility, like the Spartans' feigned retreats, can multiply the effectiveness of a smaller force. Fifth, even successful attacks against prepared positions can be prohibitively costly, making strategic victory possible even in tactical defeat. The battle also demonstrates the limitations of ancient military intelligence and planning. Xerxes apparently did not know about the mountain path around Thermopylae until a traitor revealed it. The Greeks did not adequately guard the path once they knew about it. Both sides made decisions based on incomplete information and cultural assumptions that proved incorrect. The Persians assumed the Greeks would flee when faced with overwhelming numbers. The Greeks assumed the Persians would not discover or use the mountain path. Both assumptions proved wrong, and the battle's outcome hinged on these intelligence failures. Modern parallels to Thermopylae appear regularly in asymmetric warfare. Smaller forces using terrain and defensive positions to hold off larger enemies is a recurring theme in military history. The Alamo in 1836, where fewer than 200 Texan defenders held off a Mexican army for 13 days. The Battle of Rorke's Drift in 1879, where 150 British soldiers defended a station against 4,000 Zulu warriors. The Battle of Thermopylae in 1941, where Allied forces including Greek and Australian troops attempted to defend the same pass against invading German forces. Each of these battles echoes the original Thermopylae in different ways, suggesting that the tactical principles demonstrated in 480 BCE remain relevant. The philosophical implications of Thermopylae have been debated for centuries. Was the sacrifice of the 300 noble or wasteful? Should Leonidas have retreated when the position was flanked, saving his men to fight another day? Was the Spartan obsession with honour and refusal to retreat admirable or pathologically self-destructive? These questions have no easy answers. From a purely military perspective, holding Thermopylae bought time but accomplished little else. The Persians still marched south, still burned Athens, still threatened to conquer Greece. The strategic benefit of the delay was real but modest. A military pragmatist might argue that Leonidas should have retreated, preserved his force, and fought at Salamis or Plataea, where Greek victory could be decisive rather than symbolic. From a cultural and psychological perspective, however, Thermopylae was invaluable. The Greeks needed to believe they could resist Persia. They needed heroes to rally around. They needed proof that courage and discipline could overcome numbers. Thermopylae provided all of this. The 300 became symbols that unified Greece and stiffened resistance at a critical moment. Without Thermopylae, would the Greeks have had the confidence to fight at Salamis? Would the alliance have held together long enough to assemble the army that won at Plataea? These counterfactuals are unanswerable, but it is at least plausible that the symbolic victory of Thermopylae was necessary for the real victories that followed. The ethical dimension is perhaps most troubling. Spartan culture glorified death in battle to a degree that seems pathological to modern sensibilities. The story of the mother killing her son for surviving is horrifying, regardless of whether it actually happened, because it reflects values that prioritized honor over human life in ways we now find disturbing. The Spartans created a society so obsessed with military excellence that everything else, including basic human compassion, was subordinated to martial values. Yet we continue to honor the 300 precisely because they embodied values we claim to admire: courage, self-sacrifice, dedication to duty, loyalty to comrades, and willingness to die for a cause greater than oneself. The tension between admiring these specific acts and questioning the culture that produced them remains unresolved in modern discussions of Thermopylae. In the end, perhaps what makes Thermopylae so enduringly powerful is its crystallization of fundamental human questions about duty, honor, courage, and sacrifice. The 300 Spartans made a choice that most of us hope we would never have to make. They chose certain death over possible survival through retreat. They chose honor over life. They chose duty over self-preservation. Whether we agree with their choice or not, whether we admire or critique the culture that demanded such choices, we cannot help but be moved by the fact that these men stood their ground when everything rational said they should flee. The Persian commanders who arrived at Thermopylae expecting an easy victory learned the hardest lesson in warfare. Some men cannot be defeated, only killed. Some positions will be held regardless of cost. Some warriors value honor more than survival. Xerxes won the battle but lost something more important. He lost the psychological advantage. He lost the aura of invincibility. He lost the confidence that his vast numbers guaranteed victory. The 3 days at Thermopylae planted doubts that would grow into defeat at Salamis and Plataea. The 300 Spartans achieved in death what they could never have accomplished in life. They became immortal. Their names, inscribed on stone at Thermopylae, have been remembered for 2,500 years. Their sacrifice has inspired countless others to stand firm against overwhelming odds. Their story has been told and retold in every generation, adapted and reinterpreted but never forgotten. They lost the battle but won eternity. When the Persian army finally marched through the hot gates, stepping over the bodies of the men who had held them back for 3 days, they were marching toward defeat. They just did not know it yet. The Greeks had learned they could win. The Persians had learned they could bleed. Everything that followed, Salamis, Plataea, the end of Persian expansion into Europe, flowed from those 3 days in a narrow pass where 300 Spartans decided that some things were worth dying for. In the final accounting, Thermopylae matters not because of what was won or lost, but because of what was proven. It proved that courage exists. It proved that some men will stand when all reason says to run. It proved that honor can be worth more than life. It proved that the human spirit, properly trained and committed to a cause, can accomplish things that rational calculation says are impossible. The Persian commanders never expected 300 Spartans to hold an empire at bay, but they did. For 3 days they held, and in those 3 days they changed history.